Some heroes wear name tags instead of capes. When 67-year-old Dorothy Washington walked onto the Tonight Show stage with the careful steps of someone who had spent 4 decades on her feet, nobody expected her to reveal the most generous secret in television history. Jimmy Fallon had planned a simple segment about unsung heroes. Jennifer Lawrence was there to promote her latest film, but what Dorothy was about to confess would silence Studio 6B and prove that kindness doesn't require wealth, just a heart big enough to care about strangers. The cameras were rolling, the audience was smiling at the sweet elderly woman, and then Dorothy spoke 9 words that changed everything. "I use my paycheck to help my customers." What came next wasn't just television, it was a masterclass in quiet heroism that would leave 2 Hollywood stars speechless and redefine what it means to serve others when you barely have enough for yourself. Dorothy Washington had been working as a cashier at Morrison's Market in Cleveland, Ohio, for exactly 41 years, 3 months, and 16 days. She could tell you the precise count because she had started the job the day after her husband, Robert, died of a heart attack when she was 26 years old with 2 young children and no other source of income. What was supposed to be a temporary job to keep food on the table had become her life's work, but more than that, it had become her ministry. Morrison's Market wasn't a fancy grocery store. It was a small neighborhood market in one of Cleveland's working-class areas where most customers paid with food stamps or counted out crumpled dollar bills to afford basic necessities. The clientele was a mix of elderly residents on fixed incomes, single mothers stretching every dollar, unemployed workers trying to feed their families, and immigrants sending most of their earnings back home to relatives in desperate need. Dorothy had started as just a cashier, scanning items and making change, but over the decades, she had become something much more significant in her community. She knew every regular customer by name, remembered their children's birthdays, asked about their health problems, and somehow always knew when someone was struggling more than usual. To her customers, Dorothy wasn't just the woman behind the register. She was a constant, caring presence in lives that often felt chaotic and uncertain. The secret generosity had begun small, almost by accident. About 15 years earlier, Dorothy had been ringing up groceries for Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who came in twice a week to buy the exact same items: white bread, peanut butter, bananas, and milk. On this particular day, Mrs. Chen had counted out her money 3 times, growing more flustered each time as she realized she was 37 cents short. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Chen had said, tears forming in her eyes. "I thought I had enough. Can you take off the bananas?" Dorothy had looked at this woman who was clearly embarrassed and frustrated, trying to decide which necessity she could live without, and had made a decision that would define the next 15 years of her life. She had quietly added 37 cents from her own pocket to the register, telling Mrs. Chen that she must have miscounted and had enough money after all. The relief on her face, Dorothy later remembered, was worth more than any 37 cents I've ever spent. That first act of anonymous generosity had been meant as a one-time kindness, but Dorothy quickly discovered that Mrs. Chen's situation wasn't unique. Almost every day she encountered customers who were forced to choose between items they needed, who had to put back medications or baby formula or basic groceries because they were a few dollars short, and every time Dorothy found herself quietly making up the difference from her own modest paycheck. What started as occasional dollar amounts gradually increased as Dorothy became more aware of her customers' needs and more creative about helping them. She began paying attention to patterns, which customers came in at the end of the month when food stamps ran out, which elderly residents seemed to be eating less to afford their medications, which families with children were clearly struggling to provide adequate nutrition. Dorothy's own financial situation wasn't comfortable. As a grocery store cashier, even after 4 decades of employment, she earned barely above minimum wage. Her Social Security benefits were modest, and she lived in a small apartment that took up most of her income. But Dorothy had learned to live extremely frugally. shopping only clearance items, never eating out, buying clothes exclusively from thrift stores, so that she could dedicate a significant portion of her earnings to helping customers she had come to love like family. The helping took many forms. Sometimes it was as simple as paying the difference when someone was short a few dollars. Other times, Dorothy would notice that a regular customer hadn't been in for weeks and would use her break time to walk to their home to check on them. She kept a mental catalog of her customers' situations, who had diabetes and needed fresh vegetables they couldn't afford, which children seemed undernourished, which elderly customers were clearly choosing between food and medicine. During the winter months, Dorothy's generosity intensified. She knew that heating bills stretched already tight budgets to the breaking point, leaving even less money for food. She began implementing what she privately called her winter fund, setting aside money specifically to help customers who needed extra assistance during the coldest months. She would pay for extra groceries for families with children, ensure elderly customers had enough food to last through snowstorms, and sometimes even paid utility bills for customers who confided in her about their financial struggles. Mrs. Dorothy helped us through the worst winter of our lives, later recalled Maria Santos, a single mother who had been laid off from her job at a local factory. I came in to buy milk for my babies, and I was crying because I only had $3 left until my unemployment check came in. The next thing I knew, she was putting a week's worth of groceries in my cart and telling me someone had donated them to the store. I didn't realize until years later that someone was her. Dorothy's method was always discreet, always designed to preserve the dignity of the people she was helping. She never wanted customers to feel like charity cases or to be embarrassed about accepting help. Instead, she developed elaborate systems to make her assistance seem like store promotions, customer loyalty rewards, or anonymous donations from other community members. She would claim that items were marked down for quick sale, that a customer had won a random drawing for free groceries, or that someone had left money specifically to help families in need. Dorothy became expert at creating plausible explanations for her generosity that allowed customers to accept help without feeling diminished or pitied. The most elaborate of Dorothy's helping schemes involved what she called grocery angels. She would tell struggling customers that anonymous donors sometimes left money with the store to pay for groceries for families in need, and that they had been selected to receive this assistance. Dorothy would then pay for their groceries herself, creating fictional benefactors to preserve the dignity of the people she was helping. "There's a family that wanted to make sure kids in the neighborhood have enough to eat," Dorothy would explain to confused but grateful parents. "They left money specifically for families with children. You don't need to pay this back or do anything special. Just take care of your babies." Over the years, Dorothy's customers began to think of Morrison's Market as an unusually generous place where good things happened to people who needed them. They didn't realize that the generosity came from one woman who was working extra hours and living on almost nothing so that she could afford to help others. The financial cost to Dorothy was enormous. She estimated that over the 15 years since she began her systematic helping, she had spent over $80,000 of her own money, money she had earned by working overtime shifts, taking on extra responsibilities at the store, and living more frugally than someone her age should have to live. But Dorothy never considered stopping because she had seen firsthand how much her assistance meant to the families who received it. "I watched children grow up healthier because their parents could afford fresh vegetables," Dorothy explained. "I saw elderly customers stay in their homes longer because they didn't have to choose between rent and food. I helped families stay together during the hardest times because they knew someone cared about them. That was worth every penny." Dorothy's secret might have remained hidden forever if not for a local news story about rising food costs affecting low-income families. The reporter had interviewed several Morrison's Market customers about their struggles, and multiple people mentioned how the store seemed unusually generous and helpful compared to other businesses in the area. Curious about this reputation, the reporter had spoken with Morrison's manager, who was shocked to learn about the customers' experiences with unexpected assistance and random acts of generosity. The manager knew nothing about special programs or anonymous donors, but after investigating further, he began to suspect that Dorothy was personally responsible for much of the mysterious kindness her customers had experienced. The manager had approached Dorothy carefully, not wanting to embarrass her or force her to stop helping people, but wanting to understand the extent of what she had been doing. When Dorothy finally confessed to her 15 years of secret generosity, the manager was both amazed and concerned about the financial burden she had been carrying alone. "I had no idea one of my employees was spending her own money to help customers," the manager later said. "Dorothy never asked for recognition or reimbursement. She never even told me what she was doing. She just quietly made our store a better place for everyone who shopped there." The manager had shared Dorothy's story with the local news reporter who had written a feature article about her extraordinary generosity. The story had been picked up by national news outlets and eventually caught the attention of The Tonight Show's producers, who were putting together a segment about unsung heroes in American communities. When the producers reached out to Dorothy about appearing on the show, she was reluctant and embarrassed. She had never sought recognition for her helping and was uncomfortable with the idea of being celebrated for what she considered simply the right thing to do. But the producers convinced her that sharing her story might inspire others to find ways to help in their own communities, and Dorothy agreed to participate if it might encourage more kindness in the world. The taping was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in October. Dorothy had never been on an airplane before, had never stayed in a hotel nicer than a roadside motel, and had never been further from Cleveland than a day trip to Toledo. The entire experience was overwhelming and surreal, but she kept reminding herself that she was representing not just herself, but all the regular people who quietly help others without expecting recognition. Jennifer Lawrence was the evening's main guest, scheduled to promote her latest film. During the pre-show preparation, Jennifer had spent time with Dorothy in the green room, immediately drawn to the older woman's warmth and genuine interest in other people. There was something about Dorothy's selfless nature that reminded Jennifer of her own grandmother, and she found herself genuinely curious about Dorothy's life and work. The show began with Jennifer's interview, which covered the usual promotional territory, but also included discussion of her own experiences with generous people who had helped her during her early acting career. Jennifer was known for her down-to-earth personality and genuine appreciation for ordinary people who did extraordinary things. "I think the real heroes are the people we interact with every day," Jennifer told Jimmy during the interview. "The teachers, the nurses, the people working jobs that keep communities functioning. They don't get awards or recognition, but they make everything else possible." Jimmy nodded, clearly thinking about Dorothy backstage. "It's amazing how much impact one person can have just by caring about others." Exactly. And I think we underestimate how much small acts of kindness can mean to people who are struggling. Sometimes the most important thing someone can do is just notice when another person needs help. This comment would prove to be perfectly timed, setting the emotional foundation for what was about to happen when Dorothy joined them on stage. "Speaking of everyday heroes," Jimmy announced as Jennifer's segment wound down, "I want to introduce Dorothy Washington. Dorothy has been working as a grocery store cashier in Cleveland for over 40 years, and she has a perspective on community service that I think everyone needs to hear. Jennifer, I know you wanted to meet her." "Absolutely," Jennifer said, her chair being repositioned to make room for Dorothy. "I have tremendous respect for people who spend their careers serving others." Dorothy walked onto the stage with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent decades helping others without seeking attention. She wore a simple navy dress that she had bought specifically for this appearance, the first new dress she had purchased in over 3 years, and her silver hair was carefully styled. Most notably, she was smiling with genuine warmth despite being clearly nervous about the national television exposure. "Dorothy, welcome to the show," Jimmy said, helping her get settled in her chair. 41 years as a grocery store cashier. That's incredible dedication to serving your community. "Thank you, Jimmy," Dorothy replied, her voice steady despite the surreal nature of the situation. "I love my job. I love the people I work with every day. My customers have become like family to me over the years." Jennifer leaned forward with genuine interest. "Dorothy, what's the most rewarding part of your work?" Dorothy paused, considering how to answer honestly without revealing too much too quickly. Getting to know people, watching families grow up, being part of a community where everyone looks out for each other. When you're behind a cash register, you see people at all different moments in their lives, celebrating good times, struggling through hard times, just trying to get by day to day. Jimmy nodded thoughtfully. "I imagine you've seen a lot of changes in your community over 4 decades." "Oh, yes," Dorothy said, her eyes taking on a distant look as she remembered. "I've watched children grow up and bring their own children into the store. I've seen families go through tough times and come out stronger. I've watched people help each other in ways that restore your faith in humanity." Jennifer was clearly charmed by Dorothy's perspective. "It sounds like you really care about your customers as individuals." "They're not just customers," Dorothy replied with conviction. "They're neighbors, friends, people I see several times a week for years and years. When you know someone for that long, you start to care about what happens to them." Jimmy sensed there was more to Dorothy's story than simple customer service excellence. "Dorothy, the producers told me that you have a reputation in your community for going above and beyond in your job. Can you tell us about that?" This was the moment Dorothy had been both dreading and preparing for. She took a deep breath and made a decision to be completely honest, even though it would expose her most private acts of kindness to national scrutiny. "Jimmy, can I tell you something that I've never talked about publicly before?" "Of course," Jimmy replied, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "I use my paycheck to help my customers," Dorothy said simply. The studio fell silent immediately. Jimmy's expression changed from curious to confused to concerned. Jennifer sat forward in her chair, clearly trying to understand what Dorothy meant. "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked gently. Dorothy looked at the two younger people who were clearly struggling to process what she had told them, then at the audience of strangers who were about to learn her most guarded secret. "For the past 15 years, I've been using my own money to pay for groceries for customers who can't afford them," Dorothy explained. "When someone is a few dollars short, when a family needs food but doesn't have enough money, when elderly customers have to choose between medicine and meals, I pay the difference." The impact of this revelation was immediate and profound. Jimmy's eyes widened in amazement and concern. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth as she began to understand the implications of what Dorothy was saying. "Dorothy," Jennifer said, her voice filled with emotion, "you're using your own money to help your customers?" "Yes," Dorothy confirmed. "I've helped 347 families over the past 15 years. I keep track in a notebook at home because I want to make sure I'm helping as many people as possible." Jimmy was clearly struggling to process this information. "Dorothy, grocery store cashiers don't make a lot of money. How can you afford to help so many people?" Dorothy smiled with the contentment of someone who had made peace with her choices long ago. "I live very simply. I don't need much for myself. I buy my clothes at thrift stores. I never eat out. I drive a car that's 20 years old. When you don't spend money on yourself, you'd be surprised how much you can do for others." "But Dorothy," Jennifer said, clearly distressed, "you shouldn't have to sacrifice your own comfort to help other people. That's not fair to you." "It's not sacrifice," Dorothy replied gently. "It's joy. When I see a mother who can feed her children because I helped with groceries, when I see an elderly customer who doesn't have to go hungry because I paid for their food, that makes me happier than anything I could buy for myself." Jimmy felt tears forming in his eyes as he began to understand the full scope of Dorothy's generosity. "Dorothy, can you give us an example of how you help people?" Dorothy thought for a moment, wanting to share a story that would illustrate her approach without embarrassing any of her customers. Last winter, there was a regular customer, Mrs. Patterson, who's 83 years old and lives alone. I noticed she hadn't been in for almost 2 weeks, which was unusual for her. During my lunch break, I walked to her apartment to check on her. The studio was completely quiet, hanging on every word. I found out that her heating bill had been so high that she'd spent her grocery money to keep her apartment warm. She was trying to make a can of soup last 3 days because she was embarrassed to ask for help. Dorothy's voice grew stronger as she continued. I went back to the store and filled up 2 bags with groceries, everything she needed for a week. I told her that someone had donated food specifically for elderly customers and that she'd been selected to receive it. Jimmy was visibly emotional. You paid for all that food yourself? Of course. And I kept checking on Mrs. Patterson through the rest of the winter, making sure she had enough food and that she was staying warm. That's just what neighbors do for each other. Jennifer stood up suddenly, clearly overcome with emotion. Dorothy, that's not just neighborly. That's heroic. You're using your own limited resources to help people who have even less. I don't think of it as heroic, Dorothy replied. I think of it as being part of a community. When you care about people, you help them when they need it. Jimmy walked around his desk, too moved to remain seated. Dorothy, you said you've helped 347 families. How much of your own money have you spent helping others? Dorothy paused, considering whether to share the financial details that she had never discussed with anyone. Over the past 15 years, I estimate I've spent about $80,000 of my own money helping customers with groceries. The studio gasped audibly. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Jimmy looked stunned by the magnitude of Dorothy's generosity. $80,000, Jimmy repeated slowly. Dorothy, that's probably a significant portion of your total earnings over that time period. It's money well spent, Dorothy said firmly. I've watched children grow up healthier because their families could afford fresh vegetables. I've helped elderly customers stay independent longer because they didn't have to choose between rent and food. I've seen families stay together during the hardest times because they knew someone cared about them. Jennifer walked over to Dorothy and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in both of hers. Dorothy, you are the most generous person I've ever met. You've been giving away money you probably needed for yourself. I have everything I need, Dorothy replied, squeezing Jennifer's hands. I have a roof over my head, clothes on my back, food in my refrigerator. When you have enough for yourself, the right thing to do is help others who don't have enough. Jimmy addressed the camera directly. Ladies and gentlemen, Dorothy Washington has spent 15 years quietly using her own paycheck to help grocery store customers who couldn't afford food. She's not wealthy, she's a cashier who lives frugally so she can afford to help others. This is what real heroism looks like. The audience responded with sustained emotional applause, but Dorothy looked uncomfortable with the attention. I hope people don't think I'm looking for recognition, Dorothy said, as the applause died down. I shared this story because maybe it will inspire other people to find ways to help in their own communities. You don't need to be rich to make a difference. You just need to care about other people. Jimmy felt compelled to address the practical implications of Dorothy's generosity. Dorothy, I have to ask, what about your own retirement? Have you been able to save for your future while helping so many others? Dorothy's expression grew slightly more serious. I haven't been able to save as much as I probably should have, but I figure if I keep working and stay healthy, I'll be okay. And if not, well, I've spent my money on things that mattered. This answer clearly distressed both Jimmy and Jennifer, who began to understand that Dorothy's generosity had come at significant personal cost. Dorothy, Jennifer said, you've been sacrificing your own financial security to help others. That's beautiful, but it's also concerning. You deserve to be taken care of too. I am taken care of, Dorothy replied. I have the love and respect of my community. I have the satisfaction of knowing I've helped people when they needed it most. I have a life filled with purpose and meaning. That's worth more than money in the bank. Jimmy made a decision that would become one of the most memorable moments in Tonight Show history. Dorothy, Jennifer, and I were talking during the break, and we want to do something for you. We can't repay you for all the generosity you've shown over the years, but we can make sure you don't have to worry about your own financial security anymore. Dorothy looked confused and slightly alarmed. I don't need charity, Jimmy. I'm fine. It's not charity, Jennifer said firmly. It's gratitude. Dorothy, we're setting up a fund to ensure you have a comfortable retirement. You've spent $80,000 of your own money helping others. The least we can do is make sure you're taken care of. Jimmy nodded. And we're not stopping there. We're going to work with Morrison's Market to create a customer assistance fund so you can keep helping people without using your own paycheck. Dorothy was stunned, tears forming in her eyes for the first time. I can't accept that. I didn't tell this story to get anything for myself. We know, Jimmy said gently. That's exactly why you deserve it. Dorothy, you've proven that one person really can make a difference. You've shown that heroism doesn't require superpowers, just a generous heart and the willingness to act on it. As the segment ended, something unprecedented happened. The entire studio audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted over 5 minutes. But more than that, many audience members approached Dorothy after the show to share their own stories of times when strangers had helped them during difficult periods, thanking her for representing the best of human nature. Dorothy's appearance on The Tonight Show became a catalyst for national conversation about community support and individual responsibility for helping others. The fund that Jimmy and Jennifer established received donations from around the world, ultimately raising enough money to ensure Dorothy's comfortable retirement and to create customer assistance programs at grocery stores across the country. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Dorothy's own customers, who organized a community celebration to honor her years of secret generosity. Over 300 people attended, including dozens of families who shared stories of how Dorothy's help had changed their lives during their most difficult moments. Mrs. Dorothy didn't just help us buy groceries, said Miguel Rodriguez, whose family had been helped repeatedly during his unemployment. She gave us dignity. She made us feel like we were worth caring about. She showed our children what kindness looks like. 6 months later, Dorothy was invited back to The Tonight Show for a follow-up segment. She brought with her a photo album filled with pictures and letters from customers whose lives had been touched by her generosity, families who had stayed together during hard times, children who had grown up healthier, elderly customers who had maintained their independence longer. This is what change looks like, Dorothy told the audience, holding up the album. When you help one person, you help their whole family. When you help one family, you strengthen the whole community. When you strengthen communities, you make the world a little bit better. The story didn't end there. Dorothy's example inspired thousands of people to find ways to help in their own communities. Grocery stores across the country began implementing customer assistance programs. Other businesses started training employees to recognize customers in need and provide discreet help. The phrase, pulling a Dorothy, became shorthand for quietly helping others without seeking recognition. Dorothy continued working at Morrison's Market for 2 more years before finally retiring at age 69. Her last day was declared Dorothy Washington Day by the Cleveland City Council, and she was honored with a ceremony attended by hundreds of customers, community leaders, and city officials. In her retirement speech, Dorothy said, "For 43 years, I had the privilege of serving my community from behind a cash register. I learned that heroism isn't about big gestures or dramatic rescues. It's about noticing when someone needs help and finding a way to provide it. It's about treating every person with dignity and kindness. It's about understanding that we're all connected, and when we help each other, everybody wins." Dorothy's story proved that extraordinary generosity can come from the most ordinary places, that real wealth is measured in lives touched rather than dollars saved, and that sometimes the most powerful person in a community is the one who quietly helps others without ever seeking recognition. Today, Morrison's Market has a plaque by the entrance that reads, "In honor of Dorothy Washington, who proved that kindness is the most valuable currency of all." But Dorothy's real legacy lives on in the hundreds of people whose lives were changed by her generosity, in the community that learned to care for its most vulnerable members, and in the countless acts of kindness inspired by her example. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear name tags and spend their days asking, "Did you find everything you needed today?" while quietly making sure the answer is always yes.